Welcome to the Neighborliness Network. It's such a joy to be with you guys today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation today. We've got some dear friends of mine that are doing some great work in the community and around the country. Today's conversation is going to be centering around the whole idea of connecting our faith, like the faith that has renovated our hearts, to the health of our neighbors in our community. And it's a joy for us to be joined today by Gary Gunderson, Rachel Zimmer, and Portia Jones, each one of them doing some amazing stuff. And so, Gary, why don't we just start off with you real quick? Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody, then we'll go to Portia and then Rachel.
Hey, everybody. So I'm one of the neighbors. My day job is I'm vice president of faith health at Atrium Wake Forest Baptist, but in real life, I'm a writer. I spend most of my time thinking about how faith informs health, how health informs faith. So my title is Faith Health. It's one word.
All right, Portia. Oh, and by the way, Gary is literally my neighbor. We could walk to each other's houses.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Portia Jones. I'm the Health Services Manager for the Greater Winston-Salem market from the Office of Health Equity here at Novant Health in Winston-Salem. So very happy to be a part of the conversation and continue to serve in the best possible ways across different markets.
All right, Rachel.
All right, Rachel Zimmer. I'm a nurse practitioner and a health equity researcher and variety of other things. I work also in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and work at Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist. Nice to be here.
Good stuff. All right, so I actually want to start off. We're just going to jump right into the deep end as we get going here. Rachel, you and I just had a conversation today, and I really want to frame this conversation by you made a comment to me before we jumped on here about how just kind of like the failure of healthcare in our communities can actually be connected back to some of the failure of the church. And so why don't we just dive right into the deep end, and then Portia and Gary, I'm sure you guys are going to have some stuff to say about this as well. So why don't you go ahead and start us off, Rachel?
People aren't even going to have a chance to like me before I start. Well, I have been a lifelong churchgoer. I think my mom had me in church before I was born, and therefore I've been in church ever since. And so I love God's people. But I have also, as a healthcare provider, struggled sometimes with the systems that we have in place, including the church system, because I know, at least from what research shows and what data shows, that 80% of someone's health and health outcomes are related to food or housing or transportation, the safety in their neighborhood. And those are all areas that I feel like the church can directly impact. And sometimes I feel like there's a disconnect, but at least between the white church and the feeling of responsibility for their surrounding communities. I don't necessarily think that's true in the Black church. I think I've partnered with lots of Black and Hispanic churches in our community to improve healthcare in the community. But I've really noticed that disconnect in white churches. So that has been just something that we were talking about this morning. And so we're going to open with that.
Yeah, exactly. So go ahead and restate that. You said that 80% of health in the community. Give that stat one more time, just so I can highlight.
Yes. Well, and to frame that even more, so if you look at national data and you look at people who live in poverty versus people who live in, or who are rich, let's say the top 1% of income earners versus the lower 1% of income earners, there's a life expectancy disparity. So it's around 8 to 10 years for women. It's around 12 to 15 years for men. So that means that a rich old white man will get to be rich and old, but a poor person who lives in poverty will actually live about 8 to 15 years less. So those statistics run true. Harvard did this great study looking at that. And so that being said, we know that communities have long history of being discriminated against because of race, and that has caused economic disenfranchisement, which has then directly impacted health. So the end result of that is death. So that's sort of the way I see it.
Yeah, and Gary and Portia, I want to hear from you guys on this too. There's two parts of the Bible. We've talked about this before in this network conversation. There's two parts in the Bible where we see Jesus cry. One of them is over the death of his friend Lazarus. And then the other is he's looking over Jerusalem and his heart breaks and he begins to cry. And I think that what you just described, Rachel, is massively important, that life expectancy in higher poverty communities is, what's the 10 to 12 years, what'd you say it was, like less in high poverty communities than in, than the counterparts in, the suburbs and higher income areas. This is where we should, as the body of Christ, lament over the demographics of our city. This is where we should lament and our heart should break. And then we have to ask ourselves these courageous questions, like, how do we engage? And so, Gary, Portia, either one of you guys want to jump in and kind of jump into the conversation, some thoughts on what Rachel was sharing, or wherever else you want to take it?
Yeah, my mother raised me correctly. I'm going to give way for Portia.
There you go.
Well, no, I mean, I think those are very, very interesting and factual facts. I think that's something that we may shy away from. I think if we truly want to be honest as it relates to religion, being spiritual and our overall health, I think there's components that pop out as far as being able to be connected, having hope, having optimism, having trust, having purpose. I think ultimately, as we look at different barriers across just different pockets and areas, those are key components that are always missing. If we're thinking about the African-American church, we're thinking about the white church, I think we do a lot of work across the board with different churches, and different churches take on different parts of those words that I had mentioned about purpose and trust and being optimism. But to Rachel's point, there's a such thing as social determinants of health that we work with on a daily basis from a healthcare standpoint. And I think our churches have a great role and impact in helping us decrease barriers as much as we possibly can to meet the needs of people who need it the most. And so in my experience, the church has been a foundation. It has been family. And it is it's a misfortunate that we don't capitalize on how to increase opportunities for health if we bypass church and what that entire influence is about.
Yeah, absolutely. If you guys are kind of new to the conversation about the connection between faith and the healthcare community, that phrase social determinants of health is one that you're going to want to kind of understand. If you go to any of your healthcare providers in your community, any community engagement specialists from your healthcare community, they are going to know if you say those words, social determinants of health. How are we measuring the health of our community? And then how does that connect to, like the way that church can get involved with that? So thank you for that, Portia. Gary, how about you, man? What are some of the thoughts that are going to right
Let me pick right up on that. The healthcare community doesn't know as much about health as it thinks it does. And so that framing of social determinants that came out of World Health Organization panel about 20 years ago. And right from the get-go, it was bad language, in that what they really meant, if you read the documentation, they mean the drivers of health. Health is not determined just because someone has a proclivity to a certain disease or condition, doesn't mean it's determined. And so the language is right off the bat wrong. And what they mean by social is all the non-medical stuff, everything besides a biomedical intervention. And that's also highly specific. So when we mean social, we mean food, we mean all the stuff Rachel meant. It's everything that Jesus did walking around naturally. It was food and healing and fellowship, the inclusion into community. And of course, it is these basic drivers, but so the healthcare industry, never forget it's an industry, talks about social determinants, but the faith community has a much broader bandwidth, much more holistic way. We don't dispense little bits of health like my company does. We actually think of people as needing the wholeness of life every bit, and that includes psychosocial and spiritual drivers of health. There's a growing body of evidence in the medical literature that it's very difficult to nail down exactly as an independent variable. What do we mean by spirituality? But what we mean is inclusion in the spiritual phenomenon that is the body of Christ. So that the correct title you gave to this panel is the body of Christ and healthcare. It's the way in which spirit lives in the body. That's what's healthy. That's where healing comes from. And when you look at Jesus, some people say he spent about a third of his time healing. But when you look at the holistic nature of what forms health, you realize that he spent 3/3 of his time healing. He spent all of his time trying to bring us fully into the miracle of abundant life. That's what healing ought to look like, not this or that pill.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question for all three of you, Rachel, we'll circle back to you, and then we'll just keep the same rhythm to Portia and then to Gary. If somebody were to ask you, how does your faith inform your work? What would your answer be?
I was about to say that I always feel like I'm gonna have the wrong answer when Gary's in the room. So that one I actually don't feel like I'm gonna have the wrong answer to.
Yeah, this is your faith.
Yeah, so this is pretty personal for me. My mom is a very spiritual woman. She prays every day for me and my family, but she lives in poverty. And I grew up in poverty, actually. So I understand it. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of ACE scores, but mine's a 9. And that means that I've had a lot of trauma in my life. And so I understand and empathize a lot with people who have struggled in their lives. And so I think, and I've never been able, I think I flow more on the Jewish side of things when you say I can't separate faith and my life. Like I haven't been able to find like personal life and faith. Like it just kind of is what it is. Now people who don't know me well, or people that I work with, and I don't sort of offer that up, they'll think, oh, she's just really driven to address these problems. But no, it's something that I can't not do because I live it even every day with my own family. So I think I believe in the ways of Jesus. I struggle sometimes with doctrines, but I do believe in the ways of Jesus. And I believe that his empathy and care for the human being was so deep that he, requires that of me as well, to empathize and to care for other people, because they are all image bearers of God, no matter who they are, and especially for the immigrant and the refugee, because he was a refugee. And so I think, to answer that question, it's really hard because I can't separate it from myself. I just happen to always go to school I always said, and I've always said this to God, because I grew up without a father. So I've always seen God as my father and Abba Father. And so I've always told God, even before I went to school, when I was a teenager, I said, I just want to go to school and do something to serve you. I don't know what that is, but just give me a path. And so I've just kind of always done, went one way and then said, okay, well, this feels like, he's leading me this way. And so I guess to answer your question, it's complicated, but it boils down to just the belief that, I'm called to love people. And this is my expression of that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I always go back to the greatest commandment, talking about, it says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But the second part of that is equally important, to love your neighbors. And, in the Luke passage of that one, it goes into the Good Samaritan passage, where crossing dividing lines of race and economics, religion, politics, they should have not been hanging out. And so to me, I think that our faith informs all of this. I should have said also, if any of you guys don't want to answer this question about faith informing this, you don't have to, because it's a very personal thing. Portia or Gary, you guys want to jump in and talk about the connection between faith and your work?
Yeah, so I'll jump in next. So I was born and raised in Winston here, was raised by my paternal grandparents. And so I have a little bit of a old soul. I was raised in Baptist church. And so the thought of being a giver and not a taker is very instrumental into the navigation of what my career path has ended up being. I think from me considering myself as a change agent. So I've coached basketball, I've played basketball, I've worked with families. And so ultimately being able to have a level of compassion and just being just grateful for the opportunities to share with other people, I think has helped navigate it from a healthcare system. I think Gary and Rachel will be able to play in the sand with me for just a bit that, you know, sometimes we don't make the best choices from a healthcare system, and sometimes we do what is best at the highest level, and sometimes it comes down the pipeline, and we are the people who are kind of boots on the ground and have to do more patient facing and trying to navigate, you know, that patient who has a third grade education level and that may have just left, you know, a doctor's appointment and have no idea what the doctor just explained to them. And being able to have that level of compassion and patience, I think began from my journey as a young child in church, you know, understanding that when you enter a room, you speak to the pastor just as well you speak to the usher or the custodian or whomever, that everybody is a human at the core and foundation of who and what they are. And so I try to take some of those lessons that I learned at a very young age, you know, having processes that we've learned through church. And I'm not sure if many people here are from the Baptist church, but there are processes for most and all churches that I've kind of visited and been a part of. But from a healthcare standpoint and from a day-to-day standpoint, those things are, I think, what has made me who I am. Now, I don't think that I know it all from a healthcare standpoint. I'm still learning as well. But I think, again, my faith and what I truly, truly believe that we all have purpose. And whether you believe in the God that I serve, that there's a God inside of each person. And so that's what I try to bring into the room and each person that I come into contact with.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important thing that you just mentioned there about it's basically the things that you learned about Jesus, the compassion, the care, the empathy that pours out of your work every day, right? And so for all of us that are gathering now and in the future, rewatching this or listening, I just want us to ask ourselves that question, like, does the faith that we hold so dearly, does it inform the way that we care about our neighbors in higher poverty communities? And does it inform our motivation to even learn about this stuff? Because I'm telling you guys, you know, I've given the last 10 years of my life to this. The folks that are on the call have given their lives to this. We're still learning every day about the connection between faith and health, right? And we're still learning every day about the best way to embody the presence of Jesus in our communities. And so, Gary, I'm gonna tee this one up for you. If you want to know about Gary's connection between faith and health, I do not say this lightly. I believe that Gary wrote a book that is a prophetic clarion call called Deeply Woven Roots. And Kate's going to put the link in for those of you guys that are watching live in the chat. Deeply Woven Roots impacted my life in a way that a book has not impacted me in a long time. And so Gary, maybe you could answer this question with also just kind of sharing some thoughts, you know, from your writing and from, you know, like that connection that you're trying to make. And here's what's funny is this book was written, over 20 years ago, and we're still waiting to see the fulfillment of what God put on Gary's heart all those years ago. So Gary, could you kind of give us some overview of Deeply Woven Roots? And I think that'll help us to even answer this question from your perspective.
Thank you, David. And that's to for you to say that means a lot to me, because I know how many people listen carefully and follow your spirit and guide. Deeply woven roots, you sort of get it from the title. But it's about the strengths of congregations, the body of Christ, the strengths, the inherent strengths of those congregations that are sort of like DNA that are relevant to the community, to the world that God so loves. It's like that simple. The structure of the congregation, it's not just a non-governmental organization. It's not just a not-for-profit, and it's very frequently viewed as that. So everyone here leads a congregation. We are all the time have governments and other agencies coming to us wanting us to do something. And that's what happened. I was working for Jimmy Carter at the time at the Carter Center, and everybody and their dog can you imagine? Everybody wanted the Carter Center. When they found out there was a faith thing at the Carter Center, everybody had a scheme for what it ought to do. And so I actually wrote Deeply Woven Roots to slow people down and say, slow down. You got to really understand the inherent strengths of a congregation before you can appreciate actually it can do way more than you think it can do, but you got to slow down and appreciate that DNA. I actually wrote it for people outside the church so that they would behave more appropriately instead of just trying to use the church. The shock was when I wrote it and tested it out, I found that clergy were totally shocked to learn that the church had strengths. And it doesn't have strengths. It's got committees, and it's got carpet that's the wrong color, and it's got quarrels, and it's got donuts. But it was a shock to clergy to pause and reflect on the inherent pattern of strengths that the congregation has. And it turned out there are 8 of them that have held up really well. Very important to say these are strengths that I believe God has put into the church, and it's also put into anything that convenes in a sacred manner. And so it turns out the 8 strengths work really well for a masjid or a mosque or a temple. So they're not unique to the body of Christ, but they sure help us understand our own strengths. And in that sense, they're really useful. So everything I've ever done since then has been to help people understand those strengths and how you can actually build strategy, whether it's in a pandemic, COVID, or violence, or diabetes, or any of the pathologies that catch our attention. You got to begin with the strengths, and then you'll know what to do about your hardest caught.
If I put you on the spot, would you be able to say the 8 strengths, like right off the top of your head?
I always forget one of them.
Yeah. I'm sure Kate can take some notes on this, so you guys
look at the turnaround. I've got
to. No, you can look at. I mean, I have 5 family values that we try and raise our kids around, and I always forget at least one of them. It's supposed to be the deepest thing in my heart.
The very first one is the strength to convene or connect. These are social strengths, and so the very first strength is where we convene and connect, but especially across the lines that normally divide us. And I think this is the inherent strength to go across class and race, all the things that Rachel and Portia commented on. The church enables us to have strengths to go across that. And these aren't clergy strengths. It's really important. These are the strengths of the body itself. And the clergy role is to strengthen the strengths and have the whole congregation be aware. So convene, connect, the accompany. We mentioned the kid, it's coming into the presence and doing that again across lines that normally keep us apart. The strength to story, to cast a narrative. This is one that we often think as the prominent clergy role, to get the story right. But that doesn't just mean get the theology right. It means get the real narrative that we live in a world that God so loves, get that story right. And the story isn't just what's said. The story, the narrative is what the whole body does in view of the community that may not know that God so loves. So the narrative casts that. The strength to bless, very powerful. This is not the strength we want. We want the strength to instruct and to correct and tell people what to do. And no, that doesn't work. But the strength to bless, every fundamental transformation at every stage in our life is made possible because someone casts a blessing on us, and that blessing is found to be credible. Again, not the words of blessing, but the actual full behavior. Prayer, and all of the astonishing array of tools and processes we have to create the presence of the sacred, or bring us into awareness of the presence of the sacred that's already there. And the one that's really important is also an inconvenient one, and that's the strength to endure. And the fact is, the church, a congregation, operates on a very different time scale than every other institution. We operate on God's time, and sometimes that's more urgent than any organization, and sometimes it's more patient than any organization. But we function on God's time, not the length of a grant, not an election, not how much, not till the money runs out. We have the power to endure, and I find that one more and more meaningful when we live in such a hurry up time. So it's both the urgency of God and the patience of God that enable a congregation to keep the story right and behave as people who really are fully alive and in the presence of God ourselves. I think that might have been 8. I feel pretty sure I left one off, but oh, sanctuary, I did leave one off. And that's to create the safe space. And in the presence of these two women healthcare professionals who are healers, it's important to say the sanctuary isn't the place where we worship, it's where healing happens. And very frequently, the healing happens where 2 or 3 are gathered together in a healing moment. And sometimes they're on Rachel's van, which is on wheels, but the capacity of people of faith to create a safe space for healing to happen, that's an enormous strength. And oftentimes that safe space is created by people who are not ordained, but are clearly anointed by the congregation that has formed them.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. The part about endure, we have a friend who was actually one of our first guests on the Neighborliness Network, named Mark Batterson. He says that we overestimate what we can accomplish in 2 years, and we underestimate what we can accomplish in 20 years.
Yeah.
And I think that as we look at our communities and we look about engaging a behemoth like the healthcare community and these huge issues in our culture as it relates to the health of our communities, let's not underestimate what God might be able to do if we just stick with it and we endure. And so Gary, thank you for that. Let's take a real practical turn here, and I want to hear from Rachel and Portia. What are just some neat things that you guys are seeing, the way that churches or the body of Christ, just in general, and actually, let's be honest, interfaith, as we're talking about engaging health and community, I'm down to play ball with anybody, no matter what their faith background is. If people are willing to help, we have some beautiful interfaith connections that while we believe deeply in our faith and Christianity, I just want to see the health of our community. And this is my big time belief. I believe that if our faith is real, that the Holy Spirit will draw men and women unto himself, right? And so I believe that. So what are some ways that you guys are seeing faith communities connect with you guys? And then if one of you guys could explain what the mobile unit is that you guys have both been so deeply involved with. I think this is a really cool thing, that if your community does not have a mobile clinic, like one of these ladies is about to explain, this is something that I think that is really neat. So Rachel or Portia, you guys want to take it from here?
Portia, you go first.
Yeah, so I think one of the cool things about being in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, there are, I don't know, Gary probably knows the exact number of nonprofit organizations here in this city. And so, I know with that same concept, there are many churches, there are many faith-based places, houses of faith. And, I think from a Novant Health standpoint, from a healthcare standpoint, we've understood the importance of locking arms with all faith-based places, just because that is the gateway to the community. There's a lot of trust that we're able to gain by partnering with these faith-based organizations, but I think ultimately it's still understanding what the needs are. And so different areas, different pockets of areas have different needs. And so really being able to understand what the needs are through our churches, through our faith-based places, to help us navigate where should we go, when should we come, and who do we serve once we get there. And so one of our great partners is the Ministers Conference here in Forsyth County. And they've been great as far as just helping us navigate when we went through COVID-19. We had to do pop-up vaccine events, and we had to meet people exactly where they were. We had to deal with a lot of mistrust, a lot of misinformation. And ultimately, we learned that a lot of the safety things that help people become more trustworthy, it came from the leadership in churches. And so that was, I think, very important from a healthcare standpoint, just to understand how important it is to have those relationships, because they impact much more than who goes to which clinic and who shows up for an actual doctor's appointment. So I think they're just as important as any nonprofit that is in any area. And so I would kind of rank churches, if not, higher, but as equally as important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you just mentioned there is so important, is that when pastors begin to speak about the health of your own body, right? And of just the community in general, there's this trust that is hopefully there inherently for pastors and their congregation members. And it allows an open door for trusted medical professionals to come in and offer some really vital services. So Rachel, what are your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, it's really good input. So one thing that I don't know if Gary knows this, so we did buy a mobile unit to provide free medical care for people who don't have health insurance in our community, because back in 2019, Medicaid had not yet been expanded, and I don't think it technically has yet, even now. And we have several thousands of people who don't have health insurance in our state, and therefore were struggling to get health care that was affordable. So we bought a mobile unit, actually, even with Gary's help. That was with his help several years ago. And we started seeing patients in the community in collaboration with the very first church that I ever collaborated with. Actually was in a free clinic setting. And that was in a Black church that was off of, or what we call East Winston-Salem, so one of the underserved communities here. And that was a beautiful relationship. We were embedded in the church as a clinic, and we're seeing patients, but I realized I didn't have the trust of the community at the time. And I kind of took a step back, and I wanted to do something more sustainable. And I thought a mobile program might be the way to do it. Well, that being said, we ended up not using the unit. We actually shifted during the pandemic, and we are actually providing services inside of the spaces that we partner with, which are mostly churches. So one of the churches that we partner with and has been a longstanding partner is a Hispanic church. And Pastor Daniel Sesteda, big shout out. I'm a big fan of his. We have been providing medical services in the church that he's at, that he pastors since 2019.
So let me ask you this real quick, because I think this is so important for everybody that's right now joining us later. Is there a full-on medical clinic there, or is it just a church building? What does it look like?
No, it's a church building. And what we do is we do this in, and they have almost, I always say, I don't know how God multiplies their resources, but that is a man that seems to give 500 times more than what he brings in, and I don't know how in the world. It's like the picture of multiplication.
Mhm.
So I never have much. I never have much patience for people to say we don't have the resources, because I know that man.
Yeah, yeah.
And the amount that he gives to the community is amazing. I wish he could be sainted. So anyways, that being said, yeah, our team, I have a nurse practitioner and a CMA and a bunch of medical student volunteers, and they show up at the church once a week, every Monday or Tuesday, every Tuesday. And we're there for 8 hours providing medical services to the community. I mean, it's very low tech. It's not, we don't need a lot of technology. In fact, I do home-based primary care, where I go into patients' homes and I'm their doctor, nurse practitioner doctor. And all I need is a bag and a computer. I mean, honestly. So to provide medical services, you really don't need, all the fancy stuff. But we're not just doing medical care. We're partnering with other faith agencies that are doing outreach. And so we have patients that are hungry. And so they'll come to us and they'll say, well, I can't really manage my diabetes because I don't have food to manage my diabetes. And so we partner with 2 Black pastors who started a co-op here, share the Harvest Market Co-op, and they provide food for our patients. Every other week they provide food for our patients. And so we partner with different faith communities and different expressions of faith as a part of our medical services. So we're not just looking at, oh, we need to manage this blood pressure. We look at the whole person. And then the reason we had stopped using the unit was we kind of outgrew the space a little bit. We started doing diet counseling, and we were connecting patients to a lot of different services, and it was hard to do all of that inside of the unit. And so that was part of the reason that we stopped using the unit. But a mobile clinic is a great way to partner with a healthcare organization, and they're becoming more popular. I would say when I first started the program, when I was looking at starting the program 5 years ago, there were only 2 other ones in North Carolina, and now they're like everywhere. So it's a thing. But you don't need that to be a partner with a healthcare provider either.
So for any of the 3 of you, super practical, let's say that there is a pastor, an organizational leader, a business leader that might have a building. If somebody just wants to start taking their first step into, hey, how can I help in areas of healthcare in my community? What is like the first step? Is there like community engagement specialists at hospitals? Like what is the most common way for somebody, if they want to learn more in their community, how can they get involved and learning how to use their resources to bless the community?
So I'll leap in. Most important thing for church people is to realize God only needs about 10% of the congregations to show up. We don't actually need everybody, although I'm pretty sure God would like everybody. But actually, from a public impact standpoint, if only 1 out of 10 congregations would fully mobilize their strengths and assets, the entire community would be well. It's that shocking. So what assets? Could be the church secretary, can be the youth minister, could be the choir director, even a preacher sometimes helps. It's the natural social apparatus of a living congregation. And if you would look at every one of those roles and say, is there some health science that could help inform how the choir director leads that social body that sings together? Is there any health science relative to that? And the answer is yes. But very few youth ministers, very few church secretaries have ever been trained to ask, here are 10 crucial questions that can turn you on to someone who actually needs to see someone like Rachel or Portia, someone who needs to see someone with health science. But the key is don't think of healthcare as something that needs a building over there. It's actually the body you've already got, informed by the science that God has given us, allows us to do the very practical things right. Again, think my favorite health agent is a youth minister who loves and cares for kids and then understand sexually transmitted disease and infectious this and that, and the precursors of violence and ACEs that we mentioned. A normal youth minister can be a fabulous lifespan impacting agent of health.
Mhm. Man,
Yeah.
I hope you guys are catching that of what's being said. So Portia, go ahead.
Yeah, and just to add to what Gary's saying, I think in most perspectives, we are called upon from churches for like just events, right? They're having a health event or a vendor style event, or just to kind of show up because this is a annual event that they want to do for not only their church but for the community. And I think there are grand opportunities to extend that thought process and actually have a plan to, even if you aren't doing something on a monthly basis, maybe something once a quarter, because we know even if we're checking your numbers and seeing your glucose and triglycerides and all of these things that can help prevent life-changing episodes is important to know. But as Rachel and I probably can attest to, these are things that we want to check on maybe every 3 to 4 months, not once a year. And so I think as we think about how to engage the church and the healthcare systems, I think being able to think outside the box and not only check a box when it's time to do like the health fair event that you want us to come out and be supportive of.
Yeah, that's really good.
Can I say something to that too?
Of course.
Because Portia, that's like a thing for me. Yeah. So I get that call a lot too. And sometimes churches will say this, and they're very well meaning, that they'll want to do a health screening event. And the way I explain that to people is it's kind of like taking your car to the mechanic, and the mechanic does all the diagnostics on it, and he says, your air conditioner is broken, you might want to get that fixed, and then gives you like a list of resources or whatever and sends you off, but doesn't fix the air conditioner. And so I think you have to be careful about that, because if somebody is coming to you and they're struggling, or their blood pressure is high because they're at an event and they're eating chocolate and they're trying to chase their kids around, that might not be the best way to engage with them. There might be more sustainable ways to think about that relationship. I'm not saying that there's differing opinions about health screenings. I'm not saying it's not valuable at all, but I'm just saying that maybe think outside of that a little bit.
David, let me mention one thing. It just popped to my mind. There was a pastor in North Georgia back when I was working for President Carter, and he reached out and said, we want to do a special Sunday and celebrate all the physicians and nurses in the community doing health. And I said, well, why just them? Surely you're going to want to celebrate all the public health people. And by the way, you wouldn't want to leave out the people working in the nursing homes, would you? And you sure don't want to leave out, what about the people running these organizations? You want to honor them, pray for them. And what about all the teachers and daycare workers? You wouldn't want to leave them out. And he got real exasperated with me. So, well, Gary, you'd be having us praying for everybody. I went, bingo. Everybody is accountable for their role in advancing the health of the people that God so loves. And some of us have particular science and tools and techniques, but those science tools and techniques only get in the lives of people if somebody else makes that happen.
So I love that so much, that it goes back to the 3/3 of the life of Jesus was about health, right? That's one of the takeaways that I'm going to be chewing on from this conversation, is that all of us have a role to play in our own health and the health of our neighbors. Would love for you guys to be able to ask some questions. If there's anybody that's on that's joining us live that wants to interact with Portia and Gary and Rachel, please feel free to do that. Let me ask you guys this. We had a question come through to me personally, and I think this is really important, and maybe one of you guys can try and tackle this one. Are you guys seeing barriers when you partner with churches, with folks who may have not had good experience with churches, right? So like if there's a good thing happening at a church and it's in a neighborhood, Have you seen some barriers, like for instance, in the LGBTQIA plus community, you know, like the folks who have been hurt by the church, folks who have been, how have you navigated those things where maybe pastors are wanting to do the right thing, but the very neighbors that they're trying to help are like really standoffish about partnering with a church? Have you guys had any of those experiences, and then how have you navigated those?
So I'll jump out first. We haven't experienced much of that. And I think one of the main reasons why is ultimately when we're partnering with most churches, we're only dealing with their congregation. And so it's typically not the community that is a part of that process. It's typically, those church members, those people who, work, pray, and do everything together. And so I think that's a very interesting point. And I think that is a difficult layer, I think, from a religious standpoint, that most churches may have to kind of work through. But I think if we want to look at a house of faith for the community, we do have to cross those barriers. And so I would be interested to work through those challenges, but to this date, we haven't really faced those yet.
Okay.
David, Mrs. Carter, one time I wrote a speech for her, and I thought it was a pretty darn good speech. And she sent it back and said, too weak. and she said, the first word that most congregations need to say about people living with mental health challenges of any kind is a word of apology. And churches don't apologize to the community, and we should. She said, wow, the worst stigmas and the last bastions of that stigmatize other people are held by the church and promulgated by the church and called sacred by the church. So our first word should be one of apology. And that's true in numerous kinds of the drivers of health. But we try to get people to come to us and act and behave like us, but we've already made it hostile for a lot of people with differences to feel like they can come anywhere near us.
Oh, I mentioned to say something. Yeah, so to answer your question about partnering, we partner also with non-churches, so churches that are like the city of Winston-Salem. We partner with the city of Winston-Salem. So we're inside of a couple of spaces that are not religiously tied at all, specifically because we have patients that do not want to go to a church. They are not going to set foot inside of a church. And we don't want them to feel like they're not welcome at our program because of that. And so to answer your question, yes, we do have that barrier with our patients because we do have patients that do not feel comfortable in those spaces. And then secondly, to the point about mental health, I just recently was at a church and they did a series on mental health, and I thought it was really interesting. And I said, well, I'm going to sit through this. I'm interested to see what, I've never heard anybody from the pulpit talk about mental health. And the language was they, them, their, not us, them. And I could, and I looked at my husband and I said, I wonder if they understand the statistics of mental health. Like I wonder if they understand that, half of the congregation has something in their mental health, that needs to be addressed. Half of the people sitting in the room. And so I was really I think I wasn't shocked. I was just disappointed because that was an opportunity to have an honest conversation, a vulnerable conversation from the pulpit. And it became a very stigmatizing conversation and almost like, you need to take care of this. They need to take care of this. And I was just really disappointed. And so I do think there's a lot of room and maybe some misunderstanding in the church as to like the prevalence of mental health needs and that it's not a weakness. I think people in the church see mental health needs as a weakness, and it's not a weakness. God, you can't pray it away. And so I think that's it's not a failure of a person because they might have mental health needs. So I just want to kind of like say that out loud.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something that Portia said that was just a passing comment. But man, you said, Portia, that a lot of your experience has been with folks that are within the church, not so much the community. I think that really goes to, is our church truly reaching the neighbors of the church, and particularly, if it is a church that is located in a more densely populated, high poverty community, I think that we have to ask ourselves those questions, like why does the church not have the trust of the community? And what do we do? And which is a lot of the conversations that we're trying to have here in the Neighborliness Network, is what do we do to regain our voice in community? And so I think that's a really interesting kind of thought, is like, could we take a self-assessment? Are we actually ministering to the neighbors around our churches, and maybe those barriers that we talked about, maybe those are some of the things that we need to truly address. So I wanted to had one more question come through here. This is a potentially sticky one, and I'll let any of you guys that want to tackle this one. What do you do when healthcare? So if you're at a church, and I think this is really important for us to hear, if the healthcare community is offering a service that goes against the teaching of that church, no matter what it may be. So whether it's a, gender affirming, abortion, pregnancy termination, birth control, the vaccine, all that stuff, like, how are you guys navigating that as it relates to faith communities opening up their doors? And then you guys may have something that you want to do that kind of goes against the teaching of the church. How are you guys navigating that? Because I do think that would be a barrier for churches to get involved in this type of stuff, is like, well, what if they do something that we don't believe in? Like, how is that navigated in some of your personal experiences, or even in the industry?
I think it's there, even my mind goes every which way on this. So, but I think the simple answer is to sort of narrow down exactly what it is that you think we're disagreeing about.
Mm-hmm.
And could we also have the list of things we agree on? Mm-hmm. And then you can weigh, is this an institutional partner? And so I'm always very careful. I don't do theology for any church. That's not the hospital, the wrong role. Mm-hmm. And I leave it up to the church to figure out what part of our science may be relevant. So my bumper sticker is most mature faith, most relevant science. Mm-hmm. Not all science is relevant for everything. And, frankly, not all faith is mature. And so I'll leave it up to the congregation to figure out, what does maturity look like in the body of Christ? And then, it might be the vaccine science is helpful. It might be behavioral health science is helpful. There's a lot of science. Not all of it's relevant for every person all the time.
And I do think that this is, even as I'm thinking as a pastor through this, I think that any partnership that you move into should have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding. And just because a scope of services may be available doesn't mean that everything has to be either discussed or talked about or practiced on site. And so I do think that what you just said, Gary, if it were me, and I'm just responding to this question, in real time, I would want to know what is going on, like, what are we actually offering? And we can't offer everything to everybody. And so let's agree on the things that we are going to do, and have a good memorandum of understanding of the scope of care. And then I think that would make pastors more comfortable signing off on, hey, this is an open door for you.
And to understand why the sensitivity. Mm-hmm. So, ibuprofen and condoms do not send the same signal. And
there's a quote for everybody.
Yeah, remember that. And sometimes the health science systems are a little bit proud and assume that we're the ones who know what is appropriate, and we need to be in dialogue. So,
yeah. And to that point, I mean, any partner that and this is just good collaboration practices, but any partner that we are potentially wanting to partner with, a church or otherwise, we have several conversations about what that looks like, what's going to be offered. We don't do a bait and switch. We're not going to say, hey, we're going to do primary care and then do something different. What we agreed upon, we do on site. So some of it is finding, the right partnership. Some of it is conversation. There are great web pages that help form the conversation. Like, what am I going to bring to the table? What are you going to bring to the table? What are the outcomes that we want together? And then you can use that to form a memorandum of understanding, and then revisit that. I believe in keeping voices at the table. So we have community voices at the table for our program. So we're transparent. Like, we say, this is what we're doing. Here's our outcomes. Now, but keep in mind, healthcare is also something that's very sacred for people. So if I'm having an individual conversation with a patient, I'm not going to run that by the congregation. That's a sacred space within itself. The patient and I are having that conversation, and that laws prevent me from having any sort of discussion about that conversation between the patient and I. But in terms of the services being provided, I think that is a conversation and an ongoing one. And then writing things down and being iterative about the process, I think, is important. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is such compelling conversation, and I'm really grateful. Chad wrote this. These are courageous and wise answers. Thank you. And I think it's important for us to talk about both like the benefits of doing this and how a church could engage their community, but also some of the challenges that go along with that. And all three of you are folks that I just deeply, like, immensely respect in the work that you're doing. I want you guys to consider coming on in the months to come. We're going to be doing more conversations about faith and health, and I would love to actually have each of you on individually. And so consider that an open invitation. But I wanted to do just a brief overview of kind of this connection between faith and health. And so, Gary, as our elder statesman in the group, do you
I am.
Gary's
I'll claim it.
Yeah, Gary's a friend of mine. Do you have a final exhortation that both for the folks that are joining us now and those that'll listen in the days to come, just a final exhortation from your heart to the folks that are joining us?
The very end of Deeply Woven Roots describes the joke that God has built in to the universe about the upside downness of all these things. Mm-hmm. And part of the joke is how much God has given us. Mm-hmm. And the mystery of faith health is not that we have lots of disease and suffering in the human community. We are fallen and broken. And the shock, the surprise, the joke is how much God has given us for healing. Mm-hmm. And so I would want this dialogue about the intersection of mature faith, relevant science to really be marked by joy and surprise and even laughter about how much we've been given. Mm.
That's excellent. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. For those of you guys that join us on a regular basis, we are going to be taking a little bit of a break for the summer. We're going to be back mid-August with ongoing conversations. We have some amazing folks lined up. And then we're also going to be releasing a YouTube page and a podcast here in the next little bit for all of these conversations to be hosted online so people can access them. Continue to find creative and innovative ways to connect with your community. And then real quick, each of you guys, if somebody wanted to reach out with you with more questions, what's the best way that they could connect with you guys? So
I'll jump out there first. Again, my name is Portia Jones, a health services manager at Novant in the Greater Winston-Salem market. My email address is pnjones@novanthealth.org. I'll add it to the chat. And you can contact me for any resources or opportunities to partner.
Awesome. Rachel?
Hey, I put my email in the chat. I'm really bad at responding to email. So if you email me now, I might get back to you pretty quickly, but no promises. But I will do my best.
That's honest.
My best is Gary.Gunderson, my personal email. And I do read them. I'll respond quickly.
You can respond to Rachel's.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today, and continue to engage your communities and see the beauty of God embodied in your communities as we seek to embody the presence of Jesus. Appreciate you guys.